The sky over the Barents Sea was not a canvas. It was a void, a crushing expanse of slate-gray nothingness stretched from the freezing whitecaps of the ocean to the thinning atmosphere, where the stars began to bleed through the daylight. At 45,000 feet, Major Alex Spectre Thorne sat encased in the most expensive, lethal piece of engineering ever conceived by human hands. The F-22 Raptor didn't just fly. It existed as an anomaly in the air, a sliver of radar-absorbent material and thrust-vectoring nozzles that whispered through the stratosphere. Inside the cockpit, the silence was relative, a hum of avionics and the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen regulator feeding him life. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a node in a massive digital network, his helmet projecting a holographic world of data over his eyes, turning the terrifying emptiness outside into a grid of vectors, waypoints, and threats. Today was supposed to be a ghost run, a routine patrol skirting the edge of international airspace, reminding the world that the United States force was watching, always watching. But the Barents Sea was never truly empty. On the other side of the invisible line, the atmosphere screamed. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov pushed the throttle of his Su-35 flanker E forward, feeling the raw, brutish power of the Saturn AL-41 engines kick him into the back of his seat. Unlike the Raptor, the flanker was not designed to hide. It was designed to hunt, to scream, to announce its presence with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It was a beautiful, terrifying machine, painted in a jag splinter camouflage of cold blues and grays, bristling with missiles on its wingtips and underbelly. Volkov loved this plane. He loved the way it shuddered with anticipation, the way it responded to his touch like a living predator. He had been briefed that morning about American patrols, about the invisible jets that liked to prowl the borders. Volkov didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in thrust, in maneuverability, and in the IRST, passive electronically scanned array radar sitting in the nose of his jet. He believed that if he looked hard enough and flew aggressive enough, he could strip the cloak off anything. Control, this is Red 1. Volkov's voice crackled over the secure channel, his Russian clipped and confident. I am pushing to Sector 4. Sensors are clear, but I smell them. They are out here. The controller back in Murmansk sounded bored, a stark contrast to the adrenaline pumping through Volkov's veins. Copy, Red 1. Maintain patrol vector. Do not engage unless fired upon. Do not cross the line. Volkov smirked beneath his oxygen mask. The line. It was a theoretical concept, a political fiction. Physics was the only law, and whoever had the energy advantage made the rules. He banked the Su-35 hard to the left, pulling 4 Gs, scanning the horizon. He wanted a fight. Not a war, perhaps, but a contest. A chance to prove that the expensive American toy was just that, a toy. Fragile and over-reliant on computers, while he was a pilot of the old school, forged in iron and instinct. Spectre saw the flanker long before Volkov had any idea he was being watched. The Raptor's an APG-77 radar, operating in low probability of intercept mode, had painted the Russian jet while it was still 100 miles out. To Spectre, Volkov was a distinct red triangle on his tactical display, tagged with altitude, speed, and heading. Magic, this is Spectre 01. Thorne said, his voice a monotone, betraying zero emotion. Tally on a single bandit. Flanker E. He's hot dogging at 30,000, Angels 30. Vectoring to intercept visually, staying passive. The AWACS controller, call sign Magic, responded instantly. Copy Spectre. He's nearing the buffer zone. Let him know you're there, but play nice. Thorne didn't smile. Playing nice wasn't what the F-22 was built for, but he understood the game. He eased the stick forward, dropping altitude to slip into the thermal clutter of the cloud layer below, masking his heat signature even further. He would approach from the Russian 6 o'clock low, the classic blind spot. Volkov checked his radar screen again. Nothing. Just the static wash of the ocean and the distant noise of civilian air traffic miles away. But the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He felt exposed. He decided to shake the tree. Let's see if you are sleeping, he muttered. He slammed the stick to the right and punched the afterburner. The Su-35 roared, 2 pillars of blue fire erupting from its exhaust as it went vertical, climbing straight up into the darker blue. It was a Cobra maneuver transitioned into a vertical scan, a move designed to use the powerful radar to sweep the sky above him. As he crested the loop, floating in zero gravity for a split second, he looked through the canopy, straining his eyes against the sun glare. That's when he saw it. A glint, a tiny, fleeting reflection of sunlight on a canopy that shouldn't have been there. It was below him, merging with the gray of the clouds. Volkov's heart hammered. I have you, he whispered. He inverted the flanker, diving down in a high G spiral, trying to force a radar lock. His thumb hovered over the target designator. He wanted to light up the American, to trigger every warning buzzer in that high-tech cockpit, to scare the hell out of the Yankee pilot. The radar swept the area, searching, pulsing. The symbology on his HUD flickered, trying to bite, trying to resolve the ghost into a solid track. But the square wouldn't settle. It jittered, jumped, and then vanished. Inside the F-22, the radar warning receiver chirped, short, dismissive sound. Spectre watched the Russian dive. He's trying, Thorne thought, almost pitying the man. The F-22's stealth coating was absorbing the radio waves, scattering them into the ether. To the Russian's radar, Thorne was a bird, or nothing at all. But visually, the game was on. Thorne decided it was time to say hello. He disengaged the auto throttle and pushed pushed the engines to military power. The F-22 surged forward, smooth and terrifyingly fast. He didn't turn to evade. He turned to meet the threat. He pulled up, bringing the Raptor's nose to bear, intercepting the Russians' dive path. Volkov pulled out of his dive, leveling off at 20,000 feet, frustrated. The radar was giving him nothing. He looked left, then right, then he looked up. 50 feet above him, inverted, canopy to canopy, was the Raptor. It was close enough that Volkov could see the detail of the pilot's helmet, the dark visor reflecting the Russian jet. F-20 hung there, defying aerodynamics, matching his speed perfectly. It was a maneuver of supreme arrogance. Spectre raised a gloved hand and offered a slow, deliberate salute. Volkov blood boiled. This wasn't a patrol. This was a humiliation. He reacted on instinct, slamming the air brake and banking hard right, trying to force an overshoot, trying to get behind the American. Brake right, Thorne said to himself, anticipating the move before the Russian even finished the thought. The F-22 didn't just turn. It pivoted. The thrust vectoring nozzles on the engines angled independently, pushing the tail around while the nose stayed locked on the flanker's trajectory. It was a G-turn, a move impossible for most aircraft, performed with surgical precision. Instead of flying past the Russian, the Raptor sideways through the air, scrubbing speed instantly, and slotted itself perfectly onto the Su-35's 6 o'clock. Volkov strained against the G-forces, grunting as the pressure suit squeezed his legs. He checked his mirrors. The Raptor was there. It was right there, sitting his exhaust wake like a shark following a blood trail. Damn it, Volkov shouted. He switched his radar to dogfight mode, a setting that focused all energy into a narrow cone, desperate for a lock. If he could just get a tone, just for a second, he could claim a victory. He pulled the stick back into his gut, sending the flanker into a vertical loop, a 90-degree ascent, meant to drain the energy of a pursuing fighter. The Su-35 was for its high angle of attack capability. He expected the American to stall or fall behind, but the Raptor didn't stall. Thorne pushed his own throttles to full afterburner. F-22's engines, the most powerful ever put in a fighter, with 70,000 pounds of thrust. The Raptor accelerated up the vertical climb, closing the distance on the Russian jet. Thorne watched the distance counter on his HUD unwind. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet. He could have fired a Sidewinder missile at any point in the last 30 seconds. He could have ended this pilot's life 10 times over. Instead, he hitched his comms to the International Guard frequency. Russian aircraft, this is United States Air Force. You are flying aggressively in international airspace. Disengage immediately. Volkov heard the voice, calm and digitized, in his headset. It made him furious. He wasn't going to back down. He crested the loop and kicked the rudder over, entering a flat spin maneuver, the falling leaf, intended to confuse the attacker's Doppler radar. The world spun outside his cockpit sky. Sea. He checked his instruments. The radar was still blind. He couldn't get a lock. The F-22 was invisible to his sensors, even when it was right on top of him. It was like fighting a phantom. Desperation began to creep in, replacing the anger. He needed to lock on. He needed to prove the machine worked. He armed his infrared search and track system, IRST, looking for the heat of the Raptor's engines. There, a heat spike. The IRST passive thermal bloom of the Raptor's afterburners as it climbed. A tone rang in Volkov's ear. Yes, he hissed. He had a track. It wasn't a radar lock, but it was a weapons-grade solution. He toggled the master arm switch, not to fire, but to trigger the lock warning in the American's cockpit, to prove he had teeth. Inside the Raptor, the warning system blared IR3. Thorne saw the notification. He didn't flinch. Cute, he muttered. Let's see how you handle the dark. Thorne the afterburners instantly, plunging his engines back to idle. The heat signature vanished. Simultaneously, he deployed a single flare, a bright magnesium star that drifted away to the left. The primitive IRST on the flanker bit the bait, chasing the flare. Thorne used the distraction to execute a maneuver that defied belief. He pulled the nose up past the vertical, flipping the Raptor onto its back, and let the aircraft slide backward, tail first, for a brief second before the nose whipped around. It was a controlled stall, a falling maneuver that dropped him 5,000 feet in seconds, completely vanishing from the Russian's visual field. Volkov blinked. The heat was gone. The flare sizzled out below him. The sky was empty again. Where'd he shouted, his head on a swivel? He rolled the jet, looking everywhere. Below, above, sides. Nothing. The radar screen was a blank green slate. The panic set in now. Cold panic. He was alone in the sky with something he couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't outfly. He felt like a mouse in a room with a lights-out cat. Then, the warning receiver in the Su-35 screamed. It wasn't the chirp of a search radar. It was the solid, unyielding tone of a hard lock. A red light flashed on his dashboard. Missile launch detected. But there was no smoke trail. It was a simulated kill. The F-22's computer had calculated the solution, fired the virtual missile, and scored the hit. The message was clear. You are dead. Volkov froze. He knew what that meant. The American was behind him, close, and had total control. The big mistake wasn't just trying to lock on. It was assuming he ever had a chance. The realization of the technological gap hit him like a physical blow. His beautiful flanker, the pride of the fleet, was obsolete. He was flying a biplane against a starship, Russian aircraft. The voice returned, darker this time. Check your 6. Volkov didn't want to look. He slowly turned his head to the left, peering over his shoulder. The F-22, sitting just off his wingtip, perhaps 50 feet away. The weapons bays were open. Thorne had opened the side bays to show the sidewinder rails extended, the seeker heads live and searching. It was the ultimate display of dominance. The Raptor wasn't just hiding anymore, it was baring its fangs. Thorne watched the Russian pilot. He could see the man's helmet turn, see him staring at the missiles. He held the position 5 long seconds. "Go home," said. He didn't need to shout. Vov disengaged the master arm. He eased the throttle back. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline crash was sudden and brutal. "Copy," Volkov whispered, though he didn't key the mic. He banked the 35 slowly to the east, away from the invisible line, away from the monster in the gray paint. He didn't look back. He didn't try any more maneuvers. He just flew straight and level, a defeated man carrying a message back to his commanders. The sky belonged to the Raptor. As the Russian jet dwindled into a speck and then vanished from sight, Thorne closed the weapons bays. The aerodynamic profile smoothed out, and the F-22 returned to its stealth configuration. He checked his fuel stats. Magic, Spectre, 0. Bandit is RTB. The airspace is clean. "Good work, Spectre," Magic replied. "Come on home." Thorne banked the Raptor toward the west, toward the tanker that was waiting for him. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, setting the cloud deck on fire with oranges and purples. It was beautiful. But Thorne knew the truth about the sky now. It wasn't peaceful. It was a domain of silence and violence, and for now, he was the king of the silence. He adjusted the trim, listened to the hum of the engines, and disappeared back into the void, a ghost fading into the mist. Weeks later, the encounter would be analyzed in briefing rooms on both sides of the world. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the Pentagon, analysts replayed the HUD footage from Spectre's jet. They watched the flanker flail, watched it try to lock onto a ghost, and watched the clinical precision of the Raptor's counter moves. There were no cheers, just nods of satisfaction. The technology worked. The billions of dollars, the years of research, the secrecy, it was all justified in those few minutes of footage. They saw a capability gap. It was almost unfair. In a much colder room in Murmansk, the mood was different. Volkov stood at attention while his flight data was dissected. The generals pointed at the screen, at the empty radar displays, at the sudden appearance of the American jet on the wingtip. They asked him why he couldn't hold the lock. They asked him why he lost visual. Volkov tried to explain. He tried to describe the way the Raptor moved, how it didn't fly like an airplane but like a UFO, pivoting on axis, sliding through the air without friction. "It wasn't there," Volkov said, his voice quiet. "I looked, and it wasn't there. And then it was killing me." The generals dismissed him. They blamed his tactics. They blamed his aggression. But deep down, as they watched the tape again, they saw the truth. They saw the fear in the way the flanker broke off. They saw the technological wall they had hit. They realized that their strategy of overwhelming force and maneuverability was meaningless if they couldn't find the enemy. The big mistake wasn't Volkov's alone. It was a systemic failure to understand the paradigm shift of fifth-generation warfare. Back in the cockpit of a simulator, Volkov tried to recreate the fight. He flew the scenario again and again. He tried different angles. He tried using the optical sensors earlier. He tried running away. But every time the result was the same. The computer simulating the F-22 simply deleted him from the sky. It became an obsession. Couldn't sleep. He saw the grape in his dreams. The gold-tinted canopy. The empty look who saluted him before simulating his death. Meanwhile, Thorne was back on the rotation. He didn't think much about the Russian pilot. To him, Volkov was just another data point, a variable that had been solved. The emotional detachment was part of the training. You couldn't personify the enemy. You had to treat them as a system to be dismantled. But sometimes, when he was up there in the high silence, looking at the curvature of the Earth, he remembered the look of the flanker. It was a beautiful plane, he admitted to himself. It had soul. The Raptor didn't have a soul. It had an intellect. It was a cold, calculating machine. And perhaps that was why it won. War wasn't about soul anymore. It was about math. The tension in the region didn't dissipate. If anything, the encounter heightened it. The Russians began flying in larger packs, pairs and quartets, trying to use numbers to overwhelm the stealth advantage. They adjusted their radars, trying to link data between aircraft to create a wider net. But the U.S. Air Force adapted too. They began flying Raptors in coordination with F-35s, using the smaller sensor nodes, creating a trap of information that the older Russian jets couldn't navigate. One afternoon, 6 months after the incident, Volkov was up again. He was leading a flight of Su-35s. He was more cautious now, more respectful of the empty space. They were patrolling the same sector over the Barents Sea. The weather was worse this time, a thick soup of storm clouds that rendered visual scanning useless. They were flying entirely on instruments. Red Leader, check Vector 190, his wingman called out. "I have something. A ghost contact. It's there, and then it's gone." Volkov's stomach tightened. He knew that signature. It was the flicker of a stealth aircraft skirting the edge of detection. "Stay close," Volkov ordered. "Do not break formation. Keep radars overlapping." He strained his eyes against the gray gloom of the storm. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the heavy clouds. For a second, he thought he saw a shape, a shadow darker than the storm. "They are watching us," Volkov said to the empty cockpit. Somewhere, 50 miles away, hidden in the electronoise of the storm, Thorne's successor, a young captain named Viper, watched the 4 Russian jets huddled together on his display. "Target-rich environment," Viper whispered, but the orders were strict. observe and report. The Raptor glided through the turbulence, unbothered, unseen. It was the shark in the water, and the seals were huddled together, waiting for the strike that would never come, terrified of the water itself. The psychological impact of the big mistake had done more damage than any missile could. The Russian pilots were flying defensively, scared of the shadows. They were second-guessing their instruments. F-22 had achieved air superiority without firing a shot. It had broken the enemy's will by simply existing, by proving that the sky was no longer theirs to share. As Volkov turned his flight back toward Russia, he looked at his radar screen one last time. It was clear, but he knew better. He knew the sky was full of eyes, and he knew that the next time he made a mistake, the weapons bays wouldn't close. The next time, the ghost would bite. He landed the jet with a heavy thud, taxing to the hardened shelter. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, refueling and rearming. They looked at Volkov with admiration. He was the ace, the leader. But Volkov took off his helmet and looked at his hands. They were steady now, but he felt a tremor deep inside. He walked into the debriefing room, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat down. "Did you see anything?" the intelligence officer asked. Volkov took a sip of the bitter coffee. "No," he said. "I saw nothing." "Good," the officer said, marking a chart. "Empty skies." Volkov looked at the map on the wall at the vast blue expanse of the Barents Sea. "It is not empty," he said softly. "It is full of ghosts." The officer looked at him confused. "Are you all right, Dmitri?" "I am fine." Volkov lied. He stood up, zipping his flight suit. "I am just tired." He walked out into the cold Russian wind. The sky was black. The stars were coming out. He looked up, searching for a moving light, for a glint of metal. But there was only the vast, indifferent universe. He realized then that the era of the dogfight was over. The era of the night in the air was dead. It was the era of the algorithm, the sensor, the invisible killer. And he was a dinosaur, roaring at a meteor he couldn't stop. The F-22 Raptor, tail numbered 4191, sat in its hangar across the world in Alaska. The maintenance crew was polishing the canopy, treating the stealth coating with reverent care. It looked dormant, a sleeping beast. But in the circuits of its mission computer, the data from the encounter with Volkov was stored, analyzed. The machine had learned. It knew how the flanker moved. It knew how the pilot reacted. It was ready for the next time. And there would be a next time. The sky was infinite, but the patience of nations was not. The dance would continue, the lethal waltz between the visible and the invisible, until the music stopped and the fire began. But for now, the silence held. The mistake had been made, the lesson learned, and the Raptor waited, silent and unseen, the undisputed master of the high ground. The script of the sky was written in radar waves and heat signatures, a language few could read. But Volkov had read a single sentence of it that day, and it was a sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You are already dead. You just don't know it yet." As the snow began to fall on the runway in Murmansk, covering the gray concrete in white, Volkov lit a cigarette. He watched the smoke curl up into the air, disappearing just like the Raptor. He crushed the cigarette under his boot. "Next time," he whispered to the dark, "next time I will be faster." But even he didn't believe it. The future was fast, and it was invisible, and it had already arrived. The encounter became a legend in the squadrons. New pilots would ask Volkov about it over vodka in the mess hall. What was it like? They would ask, eyes wide. What did the Raptor do? Volkov would lean back, the memory playing in his mind like a film reel. "It didn't do anything," he would say. "That is the scary part. It judged me, and found me wanting." The young pilots would laugh, thinking he was being poetic. Volkov wasn't laughing. He was warning them. He was trying to tell them that the sky they loved, the sky of speed and fire and skill, was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, dark room where the lights were always out, and something was always watching from the corner. And in that room, making a mistake wasn't just an error, it was a death sentence. The F-22 pilots had a different story. They didn't talk about judgment. They talked about parameters, about peak-kill probabilities, of low observable tactics. They were technicians of death. They didn't hate Volkov. They respected his flying. But they knew the math. And the flanker was a target, not a threat. The world turned. The politics shifted. But the physics of the engagement remained absolute. The lock that never happened was the turning point, the moment the balance of power was visually, undeniably tipped. It was the day the Russian bear reached out with its claws and found only air, while the eagle watched from the shadows, sharpening its talons. Big mistake was not the attempted lock. The big mistake was believing that the past could fight the future. And as Volkov walked back to his barracks through the snow, he knew that he was walking into history, while somewhere high above, the future was prowling, silent and supreme. The wind howled across the airfield, a mournful sound. It sounded like a jet engine far away. Volkov stopped and listened. He waited, but the sound faded. It was just the wind, or so he hoped, because if it wasn't the wind, if it was the whisper of a Sucruise engine at 50,000 feet, then it was already too late. And that was the nightmare. The knowing that you would never know. The lock that never beeped. The missile you never saw. The big mistake.